So I'm Matt Kelly. I'm from Facebook. I'm on the developer relations team, and specifically, I head up the software projects team. So I work on things like RingMark, the PhoneGap plugin, if you've seen that, the WordPress plugin we just launched, and a bunch of other things on our dev site, including our HTML5 resource center. So very excited to be here. I'm going to do a walkthrough of the mobile web app ecosystem, which you guys, I'm sure, are very familiar with. So hopefully, I can bring some interesting insights from what we've been seeing at Facebook. So mobile is in a pretty interesting spot. You know, growth is huge. Everyone is starting to use smartphones. Even my family in Ohio, which grew up on crappy feature phones or no feature phones at all, are finally switching to smartphones. You have countries like India and Brazil quickly adopting smartphones, and many times that's their first computer, essentially. That's the first time they see Facebook, the internet, everything. And it's increasingly becoming an augmentation of our life, right? So a good example of this is you may have had a kid like Dave, one of the founders in Natobi, and the first picture you probably took was from your smartphone, right? If you haven't had a kid, maybe you like taking pictures of nephews and nieces with Batman masks. I don't know. That's my only Batman slide. I just had to throw that in there to be equal with Andre. So there are other interactions you do, right? Basically, anything you're doing day to day while you're away from your desktop computer, your mobile phone is augmenting. When you're at a restaurant, you can check into it. You can tell your friends that you're there, and they can join you, right? It's an augmentation of just real life, day to day. You can rate restaurants. You can do all of these things that are parallel to what you've already been doing in your life. Now, where does the web fit into this? It's interesting because you've probably seen this article from Wired many years ago that said the web is dead. It's a bit sensationalist, but it's interesting because I actually think, at least on mobile, the web hasn't really begun, right? A good example is, think about the apps you use on your phone, and think about how many native apps you use, and how many of those are innovative, new experiences that you haven't seen before, right? And think of how many apps you have pinned to your home screen, right? I can open up my device, and I see things like Spotify, TuneIn, Mint, Facebook, all these apps that are native apps, right? Now, think about this in the context of the web. How many web apps do you actually have pinned to your home screen? How many do you use on a day-to-day basis beyond things like Wikipedia and traditional document-based sites, or desktop websites that have been shoehorned into mobile? Probably not many, right? Majority are native apps. And what's interesting, though, is that while this is the case, at least at Facebook, this is a lens into our traffic on mobile, and we actually have over double, or if you combine iPhone and Android, you double that, our web traffic is still bigger. So there's a massive opportunity here for the web to be viable in terms of an apps platform, right? So I would actually argue that the web has a long way to go, and it hasn't really begun on mobile, but there's obviously a massive pent-up demand, both from users and developers, right? Everyone here wants to build on the web. I want to build on the web. I've built on the web for 12 years now. I want to continue doing that. But there are many fundamental problems with it. So just for context, we're putting a lot of effort into the mobile web specifically, just because that's where the growth is. There was an interesting article by Fred Wilson, a VC out of New York, that said mobile is where the growth is. You look at Alexa or ComScore or any of these other sites, and you kind of see desktop web traffic plateauing or growing very slowly, particularly compared to the last 10 years before, a couple of years ago. So you look at mobile, and it's blooming, right? The traffic is massive. Again, you have countries like India and Brazil, which this is their first time to interact with the internet, and it's just exploding. And you also have normal desktop users using their phones more often, and in some cases, probably cannibalizing some traffic from desktop. So I think it's important to note that the focus from Facebook, and I think the focus from everyone else in here, should be on mobile, because it's a massive opportunity. So with that in mind, what are the problems of the mobile web? Well, I think, and we at Facebook think it boils down to 3 fundamental problems. The first is discovery and distribution. So how do people actually get to your web apps, right, or your websites? The second is runtime. So can you actually build apps using the web? Right now, not really. And the last is modernization. I mean, the biggest incentive for developers is you want to make money, right? You want to build an app, you want to give it to users, and at the end of the day, you want to get paid so you can keep doing that. So with that in mind, the first thing I want to touch on is discovery and distribution. Native kind of hasn't made right now. They're in a situation where they can build their apps completely in an IDE. They can basically hit a button, and then they can give a file to Apple or Google, and they can ship it in their app stores, right? And it works incredibly well. And then they just get a paycheck through the mail. And discovery and all these things are taken care of for them. Apple and Google tells their users where to download these apps and how to download them and which ones they should download. Now think about the web. The web on desktop particularly, and even on mobile today, has been driven through search, which is fantastic. Search works great. It drives traffic to a lot of websites. It's the main distribution engine today on the web. But what's interesting is that this is for a document-based web, right? It doesn't work well for a feature-based web, where a user wants to do a specific task or a specific thing, particularly on mobile, and they want to understand what apps can help them perform that task. It works incredibly well for sites like Wikipedia and sites that have rich content and lots of documents. So it's also important to keep in mind the shift that's happening on the web, which is we're coming from an anonymized place from the last decade or so to a place where users are using their real identity, they're interacting with their friends, and they're expecting personalized experiences. I mean, think about any popular site you land on today, whether it be Facebook or Yelp or any other site. They're all personalized to you based off of what you've been doing on other sites, what you've been doing on their sites. No homepage is the same today. It's all customized based off of you, and it shows what your friends are up to, and it allows you to discover things through that lens. So I think the question should be less about search for a specific document and more of search based off of my personal interests and what I want to do, as well as what are my friends doing. So I don't want to talk about Facebook too much, but this is how we're approaching the problem, particularly on mobile. We have the social graph, which basically enables me to connect with a bunch of objects around the internet. And all those objects are basically URLs. So they can correlate to songs, videos, recipes, whatever else. And I can connect to them in a number of ways, including liking them, reading them, watching them, eating them, whatever else. And based off that data, we can actually surface this information to users and users' friends. And this is an example. So a friend of mine liked a song on SoundCloud, and I can see that on Facebook. And then once I tap on it, I'm immediately in the SoundCloud app. And what's interesting is that this works for native and web. So a web app could also do this. SoundCloud has a web app, coincidentally. So my friend Simon was probably in the SoundCloud web app, listening to a song, he liked it. I saw it in my Facebook newsfeed, and then we send traffic to that web app. And we think this is a pretty interesting take to get distribution to all of your web apps. And of course, we launched our App Center recently. We just rolled it out worldwide a couple of days ago. And basically, this is similar to other app centers, but with the lens of your friends and personalized recommendations based off of what you're doing. And just a last note in terms of Facebook, I think we're in a pretty interesting position to help solve the distribution problems that you guys see. And we're seeing pretty good traction. So, and I think it was the month of May, we sent 220 million visitors out to web apps and websites. This is purely web, not native. And in terms of those visitors, it's ended up being 2.4 billion visits. So people saw web apps publishing things in Facebook, and they tapped through 2.4 billion times just in 1 month. So I think we're on our way to help solve this issue of web apps. And even for PhoneGap, what's nice for you is that you can get distribution on native and web from us. So you can continue wrapping your app and publishing it in the iOS App Store or the Android Marketplace, and you can still get traffic from us. And of course, we think PhoneGap is awesome, so we've worked closely with Adobe and the guys from Adobe for the past year or so, and we've built a Facebook plugin. So it's pretty simple to hook this up in your own app and start getting distribution from us. Cool. And just to touch on that a bit more, I think there are other people trying to solve this in very interesting ways. You have folks like ZWE, you have Open App Marketplace, and I think you're going to see more of this, and it'll help solve the distribution problems. But I think it's something us as a community need to figure out and solve. And we need to solve it beyond just document-based search. So the next part I want to talk about is runtime. We've spent a lot of time actually thinking about the runtime. And as you know, I mean, it's obvious, this is why you use PhoneGap most likely. Probably to get distribution in the native app stores, but also because the web runtime on mobile just isn't that great yet. You look at the dominant browsers, including Android and iOS, and they're missing a lot of stuff, right? So, some quick background. I worked on mobile platform for about a year. I PM'd part of it. I did some engineering. And I also worked closely with all of our partners. And we had about 14 partners, including folks like Zynga, Flixster, some small companies like Audiovroom. And we ended up launching about 14 mobile web apps, which I think basically doubled the mobile web app ecosystem overnight. It was kind of crazy, because we launched Words with Friends, Magic Land, Flixster, Huffington Post, all these mobile web apps that hadn't been out there yet. It was interesting because I got to work very closely with these companies and their engineering teams and hear about all the problems they were having. And Wooga is actually an interesting case where I worked extremely close with their engineering team, and they launched Magic Land. And Magic Land, if you haven't played it, you should. You can just play it in Safari or the Android browser. It's basically a city builder. And you can build this city and play with your friends and smack trolls or whatever. I don't know. I don't really play it that often, but it was a pretty innovative use case for the mobile web, and it showed, I think, what you could do. And recently they open sourced it. And I think this was a problem of, one, other developers were hitting the same issues they were when they built this thing, as well as they just weren't satisfied with the traction they were getting with the technology, right? So there were all kinds of hurdles they had to overcome to actually build this thing. So working with Wooga and all these other companies, we thought through how could we use our brand, Facebook, and all of our knowledge from developers and help push the mobile web forward. So what we did was we compiled this massive, massive Excel sheet. And basically what it was one sheet was almost every feature you could have in a browser. So we compiled that information, and then we figured out what's supported in iOS today, what's supported in Android, and also links to specs and a bunch of other information. And then another sheet, we compiled basically what are the top mobile apps today? What are people using? Highest grossing, most popular, what are users actually doing? And with that, we compiled a list of the top groups of apps and what features are actually missing from the web and what performance issues are there that actually are a massive hurdle for developers to actually build these things, or a complete roadblock. So where we netted out was 3 categories. One is 2D games. 2D games are by far the most popular category of app on mobile smartphones today, right? You have games like Angry Birds, Doodle Jump, Where's My Water, all of these games that are insanely popular and probably the highest grossing apps in the app stores. So what are 2D games missing? The second category is audio and video. So apps like Hulu, Netflix, Mog, RDO, Spotify, all those types of apps. And the third is camera apps. So things like Instagram, food spotting, Facebook, Twitter, Google+, whatever else. That's the third most popular category of apps. So with that in mind, we thought through the features that are out there, the performance that's out there, and basically came to the conclusion that we're in a situation where we're kind of, if this was a graph, capabilities on the x-axis, percentage support on the y-axis, we're kind of in this middle area where we have some features that people need, but they're not really supported that well, or they're only supported on certain devices. And we really need to get them up in the top leftmost area to actually unlock a lot of these categories. One example is the camera API. So Android has had the camera API for a while now, and apparently iOS will release it soon. But it's one of those features that's kind of in the middle category where developers have to make the decision, do I build a mobile web app that degrades gracefully across all these other devices? Maybe I just don't build it at all because I'm an app like Instagram, which requires the camera for me to completely work. And we thought through feature by feature to see where each of these actually lay. And what we did was we compiled it into a mobile test suite, and we're calling it RingMark. And if you have your phones on you, you can just go to rng.io, and you actually see all of the tests run. And what this does is it basically tests the quality of the browser. So, similar to ACID or HTML5 tests or anything like that, it tests the quality. Our take on this, though, is a bit different. We're approaching it in a versioned approach. So Ring 1 is meant to essentially represent the state of the world today. So an intersection of iOS 5 and Android Froyo on up. And that gets us to something like 80, 90% market share of all smartphones, right? And we think that's a solid baseline that all browsers should have going forward, just given that developers like you are already building on top of it, right? You expect those features, you require them, and if they're not available, your web app will probably break. Ring 1 is supposed to represent those 3 big categories, so 2D games, audio video apps, and camera apps. And what features do we actually need for those? So 2D games specifically, what's interesting is that browsers support most of the technology we actually need to pull those off, but there are all kinds of performance considerations. Canvas is slow, audio is just not good, you have random artifacts when you actually play multiple sounds, all of these problems. That's what we're testing in Ring 1. We're also testing for things like camera API for camera apps. And we're also testing a bunch of audio and video features for those types of apps. And then from there, Ring 2 is a bit further out, but the goal of Ring 2 would be to get the rest of that market share in terms of what developers are building today and unlock it, as well as interesting things that will set the web apart, right? So things like WebRTC and web intents that I think would actually give the web legs. So I encourage you to check this out. We need a lot of help, particularly from developers. We need to understand what tests we need to write in order for these features to actually work and for you to be able to build these types of apps on devices. So please check it out. And it's open source completely on GitHub, including rng.io itself and all of the tests. So give it a look. And as part of this, we started a community group in the W3C. We actually announced both of these at Mobile World Congress. Our CTO, Brett Taylor, announced both of these, and they were formed there. And right now, we're up to 90 companies and 259 participants, which Interestingly, it makes up just about every large mobile company in the world, including OEMs, carriers, browser vendors, and a lot of app developers. And it makes it the largest community group in the W3C and the second largest behind the HTML5 working group. So I think we have all of the right people in the room. Now we just need to make it happen. And of course, we're working with folks like BrowserScope to actually integrate RingMark results. And here are a bunch of folks that we've actually worked with in this group. So folks like Samsung, to AT&T, to Verizon, to EA for 2D games, to browser vendors like Mozilla. So I encourage you to check it out and join up if you're interested. And one thing I want to note is that I think RingMark is only one piece of this. PhoneGap is awesome. We all know that. That's why we're here. And I think it solves a lot of your problems. But I think we need to push a lot harder on standard browsers to actually make them better, right? I think we're missing an opportunity by kind of polyfilling and glazing over all the problems we're running into. And we need to push a lot harder to make browsers better. And of course, there are other initiatives like Mozilla's Boot to Gecko, which is looking pretty awesome. And their idea is that the entire operating system should be a mobile web operating system, right? So I think all of these pieces together, and particularly if you look at Boot to Gecko and what they're unlocking, combined with PhoneGap, RingMark, all of these things, I think it'll help push the mobile web forwards. And I would encourage you to be as deeply involved in these as you can, because we need everyone we can get. So this is just a quick example of what Mozilla is actually unlocking in Boot to Gecko. I mean, it's interesting because they're actually enabling things like telephony that aren't necessarily app-based, but using the web, you could actually build a completely different dialer in Boot to Gecko. So they're taking it a bit step further than RingMark, which is very interesting. Cool. So the last bucket I want to talk about quickly is modernization. Of course, if you don't make money, then there's little incentive to actually build using the web, right? And luckily, using PhoneGap, you can use things like iOS App Store payments. But if you ship your web app in Safari or Android, you're basically left with nothing, right? I think that's something to change, and that's something we're working on as well. We actually launched carrier billing recently, and we launched this for mobile web apps specifically. And this enables you to have payments that are similar to what you have on Apple and the Google Marketplace that basically allows you to prompt the user to buy an item, virtual item, subscription, whatever you want in your app. And in a couple of taps, you can charge them. And it uses carrier billing, so they don't actually need to enter any of their credentials. It just goes to their cell phone bills. And we're trying to work with as many operators as possible. We work with a lot of US and European operators currently. So I encourage you to check this out as well. So I think I'm short on time, particularly since we ran into problems. But I encourage you to think about this article and think about where the web is. I think the web is still in a great spot, getting tons of traffic. But we shouldn't be complacent. We shouldn't be naive to think that the web will just always win. Because right now, I think there's an uphill battle on mobile. And there's a massive opportunity for us to actually unlock this, beyond PhoneGap even. I think everyone in this room is very lucky we have PhoneGap because it fixes a lot of the issues that I talked about for you. But I think long term, we need the web to win overall. Or we need the web to be a viable app ecosystem. So the last point I want to make is when you're building web apps, think about the experience, right? I think too often people try to shoehorn desktop experiences into mobile, including pinching, zooming, that type of thing. Think about the person, right? Like a mobile phone is becoming integral to our personal experiences. And it's augmenting everything. It's no longer you're sitting on a desktop computer and you're consuming documents, but you're at a restaurant, you want to review it. You want to have a more human experience, so keep that in mind. And of course, I don't think I'd be invited back to speak if I didn't have an awesome image. So I searched for the most badass image ever, and this came up first. So there it is. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to see what everyone builds.